Chapter 19. In the meantime, what had become of Edric and Dr Entwerfen? Gloomy indeed were those reflections of our travellers when they found themselves immured in a dungeon, so far from all they loved and revered, without friends, and accused of a horrible crime from the guilt of which they felt it would be in vain for them to attempt to free themselves. Days and weeks rolled on, yet no change took place in their destiny. Every night the grating of a rusty key in the lock announced the arrival of their jailer, bringing their daily pittance of bread and water. But he never spoke, nor could the most earnest entreaties of the doctor and Edric bring one word to his lips. Despair at length began to invade the bosoms of the travellers, till one day, as they were examining, for the thousandth time, the hieroglyphics on the stone walls, Edric perceived one of them was loose. With infinite difficulty they removed the stone, and found a long vaulted passage, dimly lighted by an opening at the farther extremity. The transport of the prisoners on making this discovery was unbounded, and can only be imagined by those who have felt the loss of liberty and rejoiced at its recovery. When the first raptures had a little abated, they began to consult upon the best means of availing themselves of their good fortune, and preventing pursuit. The doctor had luckily several chemical preparations in his walking stick. With one of these he dissolved the iron of their chains, and as to set Edric and himself free of their weight, and then smearing them over with the remainder of the composition, he laid them in a heap, exclaiming with a laugh, "The jailers are dreadfully frightened when they'll find these fetters, and though they look perfect to the eye, they will crumble to pieces at the slightest touch." Edric was too anxious to effect his escape, and to listen to his tutor's exultation, and his arrangements being made, the travellers, with trembling steps and throbbing hearts, explored the vaulted passage, and found, to their infinite delight, that it led them to the borders of the Nile. A small boat was anchored to the shore, and its crew, an old man and a son, who gained their living by conveying goods up and down the Nile, were peacefully taking their supper on the bank. Edric and the doctor had taken the preparation to replace the stone that had concealed the vaulted passage, and having smeared the opposite wall with phosphorus, they had no doubt that when the jailer entered the prison, which they had entered in the darkness, he would be much too alarmed to take any effectual means of pursuing them till it would be too late. Having luckily also plenty of money, that certain road to the human heart, they easily persuaded the old man to take them on board, and in a short time they embarked in this fragile vessel and set sail. Slowly and silently they floated along the majestic river, which rolled in solemn waves like an inland sea, and swept proudly into the ocean, seeming to scorn the degenerate land it left behind, and without one pang did our travellers quit forever the fertile plains and gorgeous cities of Egypt. Only one thought swelled in their bosoms, and that was joy at their escape. Offering up silent prayers of thanksgiving, and the travellers continued their journey down the river, and when morning dawned, and the enormous forms of the pyramids were seen grimly frowning through the mist, they shuddered involuntarily, and devoutly crossing themselves, muttered a new prayer for protection and deliverance. After a long and tedious voyage, our travellers at length reached the sea in safety. The mouths of the delta were at that time a seat of extravagance, and the most universal commerce, and our travellers trembled lest they should have encountered an emissary of their enemies, who might be conveyed to them to prison, which they found they had miraculously escaped. They found, however, the belief of their supernatural disappearance too strongly impressed upon the minds of the multitude for even a suspicion of the existence to remain, and they stood upon the sumptuous quay, surrounded by the Greeks, Russians, Egyptians, Arabs, and Turks, without exciting a single remark, or obtaining the slightest attention. They wished to proceed to Constantinople, then the capital of the powerful empire of Greece, and entered into conversation with the master of Phoenicia for that purpose. "I'll attend to you gentlemen directly," said the sailor, leaving some persons with whom he had been previously talking, "but I have been listening to such a horrid tale." "What was it?" asked Edric, suspecting the subject, but aware that it seemed incredulous upon such an occasion might betray they were already too well informed. "Two sorcerers," replied the man, "have been taken into custody for blowing up the pyramids and bewitching the mummies." "And How were they punished? Asked Edric. Oh, you haven't heard the half of it yet, said the man. When they were put into prison for their pranks, the old one came to their help and carried them off in a flame of fire, leaving a long trail of light after them in the sky, like the trail of a blazing comet. Dick Jones, who was telling me, swears he saw them all going up after, the old one hanging by the devil's horn and the young one keeping fast on its tail. Shocking, said Edric, scarcely able, however, to repress a smile at the proof of the vividness of Dick Jones's imagination. I haven't told you half, resumed the man. All Sumatra rings with it. Several have gone mad, and others died with fear, and the man who was with Dick Jones, who was one of the soldiers that God set over them, assured me as a positive fact that the chains they had been on had left behind them crumbled with its fingers between the rotten wood. It's very awful, said Edric. Is it not? Rejoined the man. Thank God I was not there to see. I am sure the very look of one of those conjurers would have driven me mad. I never could abide such things. Edric, now with some difficulty, persuaded the man to return to the subject of the transit. I'm very sorry, sir, said he, but I don't think there'll be a vessel going to Constantinople for a week at least, for they've got the plague there, and our magistrates won't let a ship that's been there return to the harbor again without performing quarantine, and that is such a hindrance to the trade of our folks that don't like. But perhaps if you're in no hurry, you can wait. Oh, yes, we can wait quite well, said the doctor, trembling in anxiety to be off. The sailor, however, had no occasion to say more, for the bare mention of the plague was quite sufficient to deter our travellers from visiting Constantinople, and finding that he was bound for Malta, and that no other vessel would quit the harbour that day, they hastily embarked. Notwithstanding his vessel was old and inconvenient, and not forwarded by steam, but though a certain superior certainty of steam packets was now so generally felt and acknowledged by all, perhaps this was the only common sailing boat in the harbor. The joy of our travellers at their deliverance was, however, too great to permit them to dwell upon trifles, and as the cabin was scarcely habitable, they resolved to remain on deck the whole of their voyage, being determined to submit to anything sooner than delay their departure. Accordingly, they stretched themselves upon their cloaks, and, reclining against some ropes, watched attentively the lovely scene around them. The evening was beautiful, and the shores of Egypt swiftly receded from their view, and they felt the mind soothed by the contemplation of the grand scene that presented itself. There is, indeed, something in the awful majesty of the world of waters which, like the gigantic monuments of Egypt, powerfully affects the mind by its very simplicity, and by raising the soul far above the common trifling occurrences of life, soothes it to tranquillity. The voyage was long, for contrary winds impeded their progress, and one evening, after Dr. Entwerfen had remained for some time gazing steadfastly at the water, with a deep look of abstraction, he exclaimed to himself, "There'll be a storm!" "Impossible," returned Edric. "The sun is in wanton splendor, spreading its rays purple and gold through the waters like a jeweled diadem. The wind is not even now dying into a gentle breeze, which scarcely curls the surface of the ocean, and not a bark dances gaily over it." "That is a bad sign," said the doctor. "Have you not often heard that a storm is generally preceded by a calm? There will be no affair to find it now." The moon shone brightly, and the ship plowed her way through the almost motionless waves. Its beams sparkled through the spray, which fell in silvery showers upon the prow. And now all was still except the heaving of the vessel and the monotonous splashing of the waters as she slowly worked her way through them. The wind gradually sunk, and the sails only feebly flapped in the breeze that could no longer inflate them, till at last even that had failed, and the vessel, completely becalmed, lay like a log upon the water, which spread like a vast and tranquil mirror around her. Bitterly now did our travellers regret the precipitate haste that had made them embark in such a frail, unmanageable boat, and they regarded with longing eyes the compact steam packets that glided past them, their black smoke curling in the air as though they wafted gently along. It was too late, however, to repent, and the doctor consoled himself by taking advantage of the effect produced by the black, thick smoke, but they saw it rising in the distance, just at the lecture he had formerly given his pupil on the theory of combustion and decomposition of amphibites, till he fairly lulled himself to a deep sleep. Morning came, but brought not with it the wished-for breeze. Edric rose and walked upon the deck, encountered by the doctor. "How still it seems," said he. "Nature seems to sleep, but there's an awful stillness as such falls upon a dying patient, prophetic of the end. Nature seems exhausted, and I could fancy is seeking a short repose to rally her energies for some decisive blow." "You are fanciful, Edric," said the doctor. "You alarm yourself unnecessarily. The violent shock to your nerves has been sustained unfits you for exertion, and renders you disposed to see everything in a gloomy light." "I beg your pardon, sir," said the ragged English sailor, who happened to be on board. "In my opinion, the gentleman is right, for everything portends a storm. The cirrus stratus streak in the sky, as they join the fleecy cumuli below in the stratus cumula, nothing more clearly indicative of wind and rain, and probably thunder. And see, too, how the dark, frowning nimbus cloud spreads in black shade along the edge of the horizon, and how the birds fly cowering, almost touching the waters with their wings as they flit along. Now it begins. Hark!" Whilst the sailor had been speaking, the clouds had thickened gradually, and the sky had grown dark as night. A hollow murmuring was heard, from which it seemed to gather fury as it came, till it burst over the devoted vessel with terrific violence and rent the sails to atoms, whistling through the fearful gusts as though mocking the mischief it had done. The sea now heaved mountains high, the forked lightning playing like the withering serpents along the deep black sky, now streaming like floating ribbons in the sky, and darting downwards like fiery arrows. Thunder rolled heavily in the distance, approaching, however, nearer and nearer, and every peal reverberating through the sky, as though echoed back by unseen rocks, till at last a tremendous crash announced a fail of electric fluid. Our travelers were preparing to retire below, when they had just reached the cabin stairs. The heavens seemed to open, and like a ball of blue light fire, amidst the vivid brightness, that shot downwards from the chasm and struck the mast of the laboring ship. Immediately after, a loud crackling noise rattled over their heads, and then all again still, save the howling winds and the groans of some prostrate seaman wounded by the scattering fragments of a splintered mast. The rain now descended in torrents, and the feeble vessel, at one moment raised to a frightful height, then dashed down, and apparently engulfed by the heavy seas that washed over her, seemed every instant doomed for destruction, to escape only by a miracle. The shouts of the seamen and creaking of the strained members of the ship mingled horribly with the howling of the wind and the roar of the billows. Every instant it was exposed that she should go to pieces, for she had sprung a leak, and the water rose so fast as to baffle every attempt to make a check on its progress. The seamen were now in despair, and they broke into their trunks and dressed themselves in their best clothes. They filled their pockets with all the valuables they could find, whilst some went to prayers, others broke into the captain's spirit chest, and many rolled overboard in a state of intoxication, whilst the ship now became a perfect wreck, drifted among the wind, and was sinking rapidly. The storm, however, seeming to abate, the master ordered out the boat, and all the seamen that remained their senses eagerly sprang on board. Our travellers attempted to follow, but the seamen pushed them back, and exclaiming the boat was full, rowing off, and leaving them to their fate. An English sailor had been in the act of stepping on board the boat, the very moment she pushed off, and a sudden shock precipitated him into the sea. A piercing scream burst from his lips as his body, with a dying effort, sprang from the waves which seemed to rise after him and struck him back into the gulf. Our friends heard the cry and rushed to the side of the vessel, but alas, they were powerless to save him. The ship drifted rapidly by, and they saw his hands gleam for a moment through the waves as he raised them in agony, and the roaring billows rolled on, deep, black, and gloomy as ever. The horror of Edric and the doctor was excessive, but the impending terrors of their own fate prevented the possibility of their minds dwelling upon his. The storm, however, visibly abated, and the dismantled hulk they were on, lightened by the desertion of sailors, still swam. Light, fleecy clouds now succeeded rapidly upon the skies, and the moon, struggling to break forth from behind them, shed a faint and watery gleam upon the scene. Our travellers now, by the feeble light afforded them by moonbeams, perceived the boat laboring heavily through the grey dark sea, and struggling to reach the long black line of rocks distinctly remarked in the distance, against which they were still boiling waters broke with tremendous roar, curling in whitened foam as they leaved their craggy sides, whilst the wreck our travellers were upon seemed rapidly drifting upon the same point. Death now appeared inevitable, as it was impossible their shattered bark should receive a shock if it should be tossed against those jagged crags, and every moment she seemed rising upon a wave that must dash her upon them, floating back to escape only by a miracle. The doctor and Edric became giddy with these repeated shocks, and in despair fancied themselves resigned, or rather stunned by the misfortunes which had followed each other with such overwhelming rapidity that they devoured heads. They awaited their fate with an apathy which they mistook for resignation. The seamen in the boat continued laboring on, straining every nerve to reach the shore, though ineffectually, for a foaming surge beat them back with repeated and resistant violence. With anxious eyes and beating hearts, our friends marked the progress of their boat, until, giddy with watching and feeling the spirits exhausted as they surveyed the fruitless struggle of the toiling boatmen, they hid their faces with their eyes and shut it from their sight. In this instant, a wild and piercing cry rang in their ears. It was from our boat. She was swamped, and the human beings she contained were all swallowed up in the boiling waves, and the shrieked agony of cry of their funeral knell. The horrid silence followed this appalling scream, unbroken by the lashing of the billows against the rocks, and the low, half-suppressed moaning of the winds, till the senses of the travelers became bewildered, and they shrieked in agony. Their peril, indeed, grew every moment more intense, for every wave carried them nearer and nearer to those frowning crags, whilst the dark skies, rearing themselves in awful majesty, seemed mustering their strength to repel the insolent intruders that sought to invade their territory. The doctor and Edric, in the meantime, suffering 1,000 deaths of the protracted horrors they had compelled to endure, and which they could neither mitigate nor evade, shrank back with the shivering of the frightened nature trembling in dissolution, every time the wave which their vessel floated seemed to dash against the shore. At length, however, the fate they had long dreaded arrived. The shattered hulk was raised with a tremendous blow, and thrown to fearful violence upon the rocks, with a force that shivered it to atoms, and engulfed the doctor and Edric in the boiling surge. The next wave, however, returning, swept them along its bosom, and threw them, perfectly insensible, though it locked into each other's arms, upon the shore.